Silence is one of those forces in human relationships that we often underestimate, yet it carries a weight that words sometimes cannot hold. When you go silent, you interrupt a pattern she has grown comfortable with. Whether that pattern was mutual communication, emotional exchange, or even the subtle push and pull she created without fully realizing it. Silence disrupts her emotional rhythm, and this disruption sends her mind inward, searching for answers she was never forced to face before. It isn't about playing a game or trying to manipulate her, it's about what naturally happens when you step back and stop feeding an emotional loop she assumed would continue forever. Women process emotions deeply, often in layers. When you're present, always talking, explaining, reassuring, those layers stay undisturbed. But silence creates a void, and nature doesn't allow voids to remain empty. Her mind fills the space instantly, and it fills it with reflection, analysis, and sometimes regret. She begins asking herself questions she never asked when you were easily available. Did she say something wrong? Did she push too far? Was she taking you for granted? And most importantly, why does your silence feel louder than any argument or explanation ever could? Your silence becomes a mirror, and that mirror forces her to see herself more clearly. It reveals the parts of her behavior she dismissed, the words she said without thinking, the moments she didn't appreciate you fully. Silence turns those overlooked details into echoes. She starts replaying conversations, not because you told her to, but because your absence compels her to. And in that replay, she notices things she ignored when you were still speaking, still giving, still showing up. But what's happening beneath the surface is even more powerful. Silence removes the external noise and leaves her alone with her internal truth. It strips away distractions. It brings her face to face with her own feelings she may have avoided, denied, or minimized when she felt she had control of the connection. Silence doesn't give her answers, it forces her to search for them, and that search is often what drives her mind into a place of urgency and realization. The beauty of silence is that it doesn't demand anything. It doesn't accuse, it doesn't chase, it doesn't explain itself. It simply creates space, and in that space, she begins to understand the depth of your presence by experiencing the weight of your absence. She begins to see that your attention was not guaranteed, your affection was not owed, and your consistency was not something to be taken lightly. Silence is powerful because it shifts the emotional dynamic without aggression or confrontation. It speaks to her in a language that reaches deeper than words because it makes her feel something. And people don't forget how you make them feel. So when you go silent, remember this: you're not creating chaos in her mind, you're creating clarity. And clarity has a way of revealing truths that comfort could never uncover. Silence, when rooted in self-respect, becomes the voice she can't ignore. When you become silent, something profound begins to unfold, not just between you and her, but within her own emotional landscape. We often believe that value is communicated through presence, through effort, through the ways we show up. But presence can be taken for granted. Effort can become expected. And the more available you are, the more invisible your value becomes. Silence shifts that completely. Silence highlights your importance by removing what she had become accustomed to, allowing her to finally feel what your presence truly meant. In relationships, especially in early dynamics or emotionally imbalanced ones, people don't always recognize the weight someone carries in their life. They see the actions, the messages, the attention, but they rarely feel the absence until it arrives. And absence speaks differently. It speaks from the gut. It speaks from the heart. It reveals what words often mask: the emotional impact you had on her day, her mood, her sense of security. When you step back, she is no longer responding to your presence. She is responding to the space where your presence used to be. And that contrast is powerful. It forces her to measure her feelings not against what you give, but against what she loses when you're no longer giving it. The messages she used to skim over suddenly feel meaningful in hindsight. The conversations she didn't appreciate fully begin to replay with more weight. Even the small things, your consistency, your attention, the way you listened, start to take up more mental and emotional space than she expected. Your silence reminds her that you weren't just another voice in her life. You were a source of emotional stability. And when that stability is no longer accessible on demand, she begins to value the strength behind it. This is where many women experience a shift from confidence to curiosity, from curiosity to realization, and sometimes from realization to regret. Because value is often recognized retrospectively, people need to experience the contrast to understand what they had. Your absence also gives her room to see her own behavior clearly. When you stop showing up the way you used to, she begins to ask herself why. She wonders if she misread your intentions, if she underestimated your importance, or if she pushed you away without meaning to. She starts to reflect, not because you asked her to, but because your silence invites her to look inward. And inward reflection is far more powerful than outward confrontation. Silence elevates your value not by demanding attention, but by proving you don't need to seek it. It shows self-respect. It shows emotional discipline. It shows that your worth is not based on how much you give, but on who you are. And that recognition is often what makes her realize just how deeply she felt your presence all along. So remember this, value doesn't always shine in the light of your presence. Sometimes it reveals itself in the shadow of your absence. And when a woman feels that shift, her perception of you changes forever. One of the most overlooked truths in relationships is that control isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's subtle, a shift in tone, a slow withdrawal of effort, a pattern of inconsistency that keeps you guessing. Many women don't even intend to create this dynamic. It's simply a learned behavior, a familiar rhythm they slip into because it gives them a sense of security. When she feels like she has your full attention, when she senses that you're emotionally invested, she may unconsciously test the limits of that investment. Not to hurt you, but to understand where she stands. It becomes a quiet way of maintaining power, of managing her own insecurities by keeping you slightly off balance. But silence interrupts that rhythm instantly. When you stop responding the way she expects, when you don't chase, don't question, don't fill the silence with explanations, you break the cycle she's been relying on. Suddenly the emotional script she's been using no longer works. The behavior that once gave her a sense of control now leaves her with uncertainty. And uncertainty is a powerful motivator. Instead of you wondering where you stand, she begins to wonder where she stands. Instead of you overthinking her actions, she begins to overthink yours. Your silence shifts the center of gravity. It creates a pause in the dynamic that makes her realize she can't pull you emotionally in the ways she once could. This isn't about punishment or manipulation. It's about removing yourself from a dynamic that was draining your energy. It's about reclaiming your emotional balance. And in that balance, you naturally reclaim your power, because the moment you stop feeding a pattern, the pattern collapses. Psychologically, silence removes her sense of predictability. Women, like anyone, find comfort in knowing how someone will respond. It gives them emotional footing. When you don't respond the way she anticipated, her mind starts working overtime. She begins asking herself questions she never had to ask before. Why isn't he reacting? Why is he so calm? Did I push too far? Has he moved on? These questions arise not because you're trying to evoke fear or insecurity, but because silence forces her to confront the possibility that she may lose the influence she had. And here is where your power is restored, not through force, not through confrontation, but through the quiet confidence of choosing peace over chaos. When you remove yourself from an emotional tug of war, you show her that your stability is not something she can shake. You show her that your emotions are your own, not hers to pull at will. That level of self-command is rare, and it commands respect. It shifts the entire dynamic from one where you respond to her moods to one where she reconsiders her approach to you. So understand this: silence is not weakness. It is not retreat. It is a declaration of emotional independence. And a man who can stand in that silence, calm, grounded, unbothered, is a man whose presence becomes impossible to ignore. There's a certain kind of power that doesn't need to raise its voice, doesn't need to beg for attention, and doesn't need to constantly prove itself. It's the power of a man who is rooted in himself, a man who is steady, composed, and emotionally mature. When you choose silence, not as a weapon, but as a reflection of your inner calm, you communicate something far stronger than any argument or explanation ever could. You communicate that you are governed by intention, not impulse. And that kind of presence is rare.
Yeah.
Women notice it immediately. In a world where so many people respond out of fear, insecurity, or the need for validation, your ability to remain centered becomes a statement all its own. It tells her you are not controlled by her moods or her inconsistencies. It shows her that your peace is not fragile. And more importantly, it signals that you have a strong relationship with yourself. One that you won't sacrifice just to maintain a connection. This is what emotional maturity looks like in practice. Not silence that punishes, but silence that protects. Silence that reflects self-awareness. Silence that honors your boundaries. When you respond with stillness instead of reaction, you shift the atmosphere of the entire dynamic. She begins to see you differently, not as someone she can easily sway, but as someone who chooses his responses consciously. Your silence becomes the evidence that you are a man who thinks before he speaks, who values clarity over chaos, who refuses to engage in emotional spirals that lead nowhere healthy. And this is when something powerful happens. Your silence becomes more meaningful than any words you could offer. It tells her everything she needs to know about your strength. Women are deeply perceptive. They don't just hear what you say, they feel who you are. They pick up on your energy, your restraint, your confidence. When you remain composed, she notices. When you refuse to be pulled into unnecessary conflict, she feels it. And when you hold your ground with quiet certainty, she respects it. Even if she doesn't say it out loud, emotional maturity is magnetic because it makes her feel safe. Not in the sense that you're predictable, but in the sense that you're stable. You're not tossed around by every emotional wave, you're anchored. And that anchor becomes the foundation of your presence. It creates a contrast that is impossible to ignore. Your silence is no longer empty. It's intentional. It carries weight. It carries meaning. It carries identity. It shows her that you are not defined by her approval or her reaction. You are defined by your own inner compass. So remember this: silence rooted in emotional maturity is not withdrawal. It is wisdom. It is the quiet confidence of a man who knows his worth without needing to announce it. And in a world full of noise, that kind of silence speaks the loudest.